At my son's promotion party, he raised his glass and proudly said, "I want to thank the father-in-law who truly raised me, the one who guided me to success." The whole room burst into applause. In that moment, I realized I had never truly been respected. So I stood up and quietly walked away. The next day, I would show my son exactly what kind of man the father he looked down on really was. Welcome to our story. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Quick note, this is a fictional story created to enhance storytelling and reflection. Any similarities to real people or places are coincidental, but the message behind it remains meaningful and beneficial for reflection. I still remember the exact moment I stopped being a father and became a fool. Frank Sullivan, a 70-year-old retired factory foreman with hands permanently stained by grease and hard work, sat on my Asheville porch, clutching an invitation that cost more than my first car. The morning fog was rolling off the Blue Ridge Mountains, thick and gray, like the smoke from the old Champion Mill where I spent 40 years of my life. The mail truck had just rattled away, leaving behind a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt heavy enough to be a legal summons. It wasn't. The silver foil embossed on the front caught the pale North Carolina sun, announcing a senior director promotion dinner at the Grand Bohemian Hotel for my son Ryan. I ran my thumb over the raised lettering, my calloused skin snagging on the expensive cardstock. It had been 4 years since I'd heard his voice or seen his face in anything other than a local business journal. People around town thought we just had a mutual cooling off, a natural drifting between a blue-collar father and a high-climbing son. They were wrong. The silence wasn't a drift. It was a banishment. Ryan had made it clear the last time we spoke that my presence was an active liability to the life he was building. He'd told me in no uncertain terms that I just didn't fit the image he needed to project. I was the man who had worked double shifts to pay for his private schooling, but I was also the man whose rough hands and unrefined stories made his colleagues uncomfortable at the one gala he'd been foolish enough to invite me to. Funny how a piece of expensive paper can make a man forget 4 years of being treated like a ghost. Isn't it? I sat there listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock through the open screen door, smelling the familiar mix of old wood and the faint, permanent scent of motor oil that seemed to leak from my pores. I should have stayed on this porch. I should have been wise enough to see this invitation for what it was, a performance of filial duty, not an olive branch. But as the fog began to lift, a desperate, stubborn hope started to itch at the back of my mind. Maybe the director title had softened him. Maybe he finally realized that the image he was so scared of losing was built on the back of the foreman he was trying to forget. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a foreman, stained, calloused, and utterly out of place against the silver foil of the invitation. I stood up the wood of the porch, groaning under my boots, and walked into the house toward my bedroom. I hadn't owned a proper suit since Mary's funeral, and even that one had been off the rack and smelled of mothballs. If I was going to show up at the Grand Bohemian, I couldn't go as the man who spent his life in denim and work boots. I opened my dresser and pulled out my emergency savings envelope. It was thin, representing a decade of careful hoarding from my pension. I counted out 30% of it right there on the bedspread. It was enough to buy a suit that cost more than a month of my mortgage. I wasn't going there to beg for his love. I was going there to reclaim the son I thought I knew. But first I had to look like a man worth acknowledging. The chime above the door sounded like a warning bell as I stepped onto the polished marble of Biltmore Avenue's most expensive clothier. I was a long way from the porch in Asheville, though the distance was only measured in a few miles and a lifetime of class. My boots, scuffed at the toes and worn at the heels, felt heavy and loud against the stone floor, echoing in the hushed cathedral-like air of the shop. I could smell expensive cedar and a hint of lavender scents that were a far cry from the motor oil and old wood I had breathed in for 70 years. I clutched the envelope in my pocket, like a shield, the sharp corner of the cardstock digging into my palm. It was the only reason I had the courage to be here, though the money in my other pocket felt like a betrayal. You see, the cash I was carrying wasn't just my emergency savings. I'd reached into the jar meant for Mary's headstone repair, the one that had been tilting toward the mountain soil for a decade. I'd told myself she would understand that her son's dignity was worth more than a straight piece of granite, but my conscience felt like a lead weight in my chest. A young clerk, with a perfectly knotted tie and skin that had never seen a day of factory sun, looked through me with practiced indifference. He didn't see the man who had kept the machines running at the Champion Mill. He only saw the grease that had made a permanent home in my cuticles. I forced my chin up, meeting his eyes with the same steady gaze I'd used to quiet rowdy mill hands during a double shift. I told him I needed something for a promotion dinner, something that said I belonged at the head table. He didn't smile, but he did gesture toward the back. He told me their bespoke options started at $2,000. His voice smooth and cold as a sheet of stainless steel. $300. In the mill that was 40 hours of sweat and cotton dust. Here it barely covered the sleeves. I swallowed my pride and followed him to the racks, my fingers brushing against swatches of Italian wool that felt too soft to be real. One particular gray fabric pulled me back 7 years, to the day I co-signed Ryan's MBA loan. I remembered the oppressive heat of the factory floor, the way my lungs used to burn as I worked 18-hour days to ensure the interest didn't swallow his future whole. I told him back then not to worry about the cost that it was for his future. He'd promised to make me proud, promised to be the man I couldn't be. I realize now that every thread I was about to buy was paid for with years of my own life that I would never get back. The three-way mirror didn't show a father. It showed a man trying to buy back a seat at a table he'd already built with his own blood. When the tailor finally draped the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders and pinned the cuffs, the transformation was jarring. I didn't feel empowered. Instead, I saw a stranger staring back at me. With the structure of the shoulders and the sharp cut of the lapel, I didn't look like Frank Sullivan anymore. I looked exactly like the man Ryan tried to replace me with, Charles Beaumont. I looked at the stranger in the mirror wearing a dead man's dignity and wondered if Ryan would even recognize the father beneath the wool. A suit only changes the shell. It is the gift you carry that signals your place at the table, or so I told myself as I counted the remaining $20 bills in my wallet. I stepped out of the tailor's shop, the weight of the wool stranger still heavy on my mind, and walked toward the jewelry store 2 blocks down. My boots felt like lead on the sidewalk, but I kept my shoulders square. The pen set I was looking for wasn't just a gift. It was a physical peace offering I bought using the very last of my liquid cash, leaving me with zero cushion for the coming month. I knew the risk. I knew that if the water heater gave out, or the truck needed a new alternator, I'd be staring at an empty cupboard. But a senior director needs a tool that matches his title, and I wanted Ryan to see that I understood the height he'd reached. The jewelry store smelled of velvet and dead money, a scent that did not know the honest tang of sawdust or sweat. It was the kind of silence that makes you whisper, even when there's no one else around. I stood before the glass case, staring at a heavy gold-engraved pen set nestled in a bed of midnight blue silk. I asked the jeweler if he could engrave it by Thursday. Initially, I wanted to write something that mattered, something like, "To Ryan from the hands that built the foundation." I wanted him to remember the calluses and the double shifts every time he signed a corporate merger. But as the jeweler waited, his silver pen poised over an order pad, my courage faltered. I didn't want to start the night with a reminder of the grease he worked so hard to wash away. I told him to make it simple, just to Ryan with pride. By the evening of the dinner, the air in my small house felt as tight as a drum. I stood in the bathroom shaving with a straight razor I'd kept since my own father passed. The steam on the bathroom mirror obscured my face, leaving only the outline of a man who looked older than he felt. I performed the quiet rituals of a working man preparing for battle, the scratch of the razor against my throat, the only sound in the house. I looked at the suit hanging on the back of the door and the boxed pen on the nightstand. Why do we dress our failures in silk and gold, hoping the shine will blind the people who know us best? I whispered to the empty room that tonight, Mary, I am going to bring him home. I wanted to believe that the 4-year rift was just a long shift we were both finally clocking out of. I dressed slowly, my thick fingers struggling with the small buttons of the new shirt. I grabbed the velvet box, tucked it into my breast pocket, and headed for the door. The cold February air hit me as I walked to my old Ford truck. The engine groaned like it knew where we were going, a low mechanical protest against the polished luxury of downtown. I climbed in the scent of aftershave mixing with the old truck upholstery I'd never quite been able to clean. I realized too late that I'd left the pen's warranty card on the kitchen counter, and on it, the jeweler had accidentally left the receipt showing the payment plan I had to set up, exposing the raw edge of my financial struggle. I pulled out of the driveway, the truck rattling down the hill. I didn't see the white Mercedes parked 3 houses down, its headlights dark, watching me leave. The headlights of a 6-figure Porsche blinded my rearview mirror, a silent demand for my rusted Ford to vanish from the cobblestone drive of the Grand Bohemian. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my calloused knuckles white in the glare. As I idled in the valet line, the white Mercedes that had been parked 3 houses down from mine pulled up directly behind the Porsche. I recognized the custom license plate instantly. It was Ryan. I watched him through my mirrors, expecting a wave or a flash of high beams, but he didn't even look toward the battered truck in front of him. He was busy adjusting his silk tie, his eyes fixed on the hotel's ornate entrance, as if I were just a piece of road debris delaying his arrival. I pulled forward the engine of my truck, letting out a final shuddering gasp before I turned the key. A young valet wearing pristine white gloves and a uniform that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined approached the driver's side. He looked at the peeling paint on my door with a mix of pity and visible concern, his nose wrinkling at the faint scent of diesel and mountain dirt. He asked if I was sure I wanted to park this out front, his voice dripping with the kind of forced politeness that's worse than an insult. I handed him my cold metal keys and told him it had 4 wheels and a current tag, so it would sit just fine. The valet didn't just take my keys. He took my dignity, handling the metal like it was contaminated with the very grease that paid for my son's life. I stepped out, smoothing the fabric of my new suit, though it felt like a costume that didn't quite fit the man underneath. The air was thick with the roar of luxury engines and the scent of expensive exhaust, a sharp contrast to the smell of cedar and leather wafting from the hotel. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, the weight of the wood requiring a strength my 70-year-old shoulders had to fight to provide. Inside the lobby was a cathedral of wealth filled with hunting lodge luxury taxidermy staring down from the walls and velvet furniture that looked too soft to sit on. Hushed tones of old money vibrated in the air, a frequency I couldn't quite tune into. I clutched the gold pen box tightly in my breast pocket, the sharp corner a constant reminder of why I was here. I noticed the guests in designer gowns instinctively give me a wider berth as I walked toward the directory. They didn't see the suit. They saw the 40 years of factory floor rhythm in my walk, a heavy-set gait that no amount of Italian wool could hide. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, and I was a heretic walking down the aisle in a suit that still smelled of the department store rack. I reached the digital directory searching for the ballroom location, but the words on the screen made the blood turn cold in my veins. It didn't just say Ryan Sullivan Promotion. Stuktila. In bold gold letters it read, The Beaumont Sullivan Advancement. My son hadn't just invited me to a dinner. He had invited me to a merger where his own identity had been secondary. On the directory in bold gold letters it read, The Beaumont Sullivan Advancement. My name was second, and it was smaller, like a footnote to a story I wasn't supposed to read. The swell of a string quartet shouldn't feel like a physical blow to the chest. But as I stepped into the grand ballroom, the music sounded like a funeral march for my own dignity. I had seen that directory in the lobby, that gold-lettered insult that placed my name as a secondary thought to the Beaumont Empire. and the simmering anger in my gut was starting to feel like a steady industrial heat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the stiff invitation, the one I had spent $300 to match with a suit I didn't recognize. As I turned it over in the dim light of the entryway, I noticed a tiny lime green sticker on the back. It was a color-coded dot, a silent system of classification I hadn't understood until now. I watched a man in front of me hand over an invitation with a gold dot and get escorted toward the stage. I realized then that my green dot was the mark of a tier meant for courtesy invites, only a seat provided out of obligation rather than respect. A hostess with a neck as stiff as the starch in her collar barely looked at my face before directing me toward the back. She told me I was at table 18, right past the massive pillars that obstructed the view of the podium. I asked if there hadn't been a mistake, reminding her that I was the father of the man being promoted. She didn't blink. She simply repeated the number and gestured toward the shadows. Table 18. The number felt like a brand. I wasn't a guest. I was a ghost they were forced to haunt their own party with. I navigated the sea of crystal chandeliers and white linen, my ears ringing with the high-pitched clinking of silverware against fine china. I found my seat in a dark corner, wedged between a massive floral arrangement that smelled of heavy perfume and the service doors that periodically burst open with the smell of kitchen grease and the clatter of bus tubs. I sat on a cold metal chair, my back to the wall, surrounded by junior associates who looked at me as if I were a lost janitor. Across that sea of crystal and white linen, my children looked like islands I'd spent 40 years building only for them to declare me a foreign invader. I watched the VIP table near the stage bathed in the warm glow of spotlights. Ryan Sullivan, my 42-year-old son who stood at the center of the room in a tailored Italian suit, was laughing with Charles Beaumont. Ryan's eyes never strayed far from his wealthy father-in-law, looking for cues on how to hold his glass and when to smile. Sitting next to him was Sarah Sullivan, my 44-year-old daughter, whose jewelry rattled with every nervous movement she made. She was an interior designer who spent her life making things look perfect on the surface, and tonight she was the masterpiece of her own making. They looked like a cohesive high society unit, and the empty chair I had hoped would be for me was occupied by Charles's personal assistant. I saw Sarah lean in and say something to Ryan, her hand covering her mouth, and for the first time in my life, I saw my daughter look at me with something that wasn't love. It was pity. She caught my eye for the briefest of seconds across the distance, and then quickly looked away, whispering again to her brother. Ryan didn't even turn his head. I didn't travel 60 miles and spend $300 to be a background extra in my own son's life. So I pushed back my chair and began the long trek across that sea of polished oak and snobbery. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor with a sharp, discordant screech that seemed to linger far too long in the quiet moments between the string quartet's notes. I kept my gaze fixed on the VIP table, ignoring the pitying look Sarah had just cast my way. I was a Sullivan, and even if my children had forgotten the weight of that name, I hadn't. I maneuvered through the cocktail crowd, clutching the gold-embossed pen box in my breast pocket like a life raft. The glint of champagne in crystal flutes and the shimmer of diamond earrings blinded me, but I pressed on until I was within 5 feet of Ryan. He was mid-laugh, holding court with a group of silver-haired men in charcoal suits. I recognized a few of them. They were the very bank executives who handled the local pension funds back at the mill. I stepped forward, my hand reaching for the gift. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I overheard Ryan's hushed explanation to the men. He leaned in, gesturing vaguely toward me, and whispered that his father was experiencing a bit of a mental decline, and that they shouldn't mind my presence. The betrayal hit me harder than the 4 years of silence ever had. He wasn't just hiding me. He was discrediting my mind to protect his image. I managed to say his name, my voice sounding rough and alien in that refined air. Ryan spotted me, and for a split second, his face drained of color a flicker of the boy I used to know appearing behind the mask of the senior director. Then the mask snapped back. He deliberately turned his back to me, engaging in a loud, animated conversation with Charles Beaumont about interest rates. The air in that room was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the suffocating stench of an ungrateful child's ambition. I stood there in the dead zone of the conversation, a ghost in a new suit, feeling the eyes of the executives turn from me as if I were a smudge on a lens. Before I could find the words to demand he look at me, Jen Sullivan, 39, the daughter of the city's most prominent developer, moved through the crowd with a grace that felt like a barrier. She stepped directly into my path, her smile as sharp and cold as a razor blade. She placed a hand on my arm, not a gesture of affection, but a firm, controlling anchor. She whispered that I was bothering the guests and that my working-class vibe was causing a stir among the board members. Bothering the guests. That was the phrase. I was a flea on the silk of their perfect new lives. She subtly indicated the security guard standing by the service doors, making it clear that if I didn't return to my designated corner, I would be escorted out like a common trespasser. I was forced back to table 18, my pride trailing behind me like a shroud. As I sank into my chair, I noticed a small gift tag attached to a massive floral centerpiece at the head table. It was Sarah's handwriting, thanking Charles Beaumont for being the grandfather my children deserve. I sat back down, the heavy gold pen burning a hole in my pocket, and watched as Charles Beaumont raised a glass to family, while my own son looked right through me like I was made of glass. The crystal chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the room into a darkness that felt far too much like the silence in my own house. I sat back down at table 18, the heavy gold pen burning a hole in my pocket, and watched as Charles Beaumont raised a glass to family, while my own son looked right through me like I was made of glass. As my eyes adjusted to the artificial night, I realized that the seating chart wasn't just some oversight by a harried assistant. Ryan had personally vetted this list. He had ensured that the people surrounding me at the table behind the pillar were those he considered unimportant enough to witness my isolation without it affecting his stock price. A single surgical spotlight cut through the dark, finding Ryan at the head table. He stood with a confidence that I realize I didn't pay for it. Was grown in someone else's garden, watered by the approval of men who never knew the grit of the factory floor. As he began his walk toward the podium, the room fell into a hush so profound I could hear the nervous, rhythmic thrumming of my own pulse against my tight collar. The air was stale, smelling of expensive floor wax and the lingering scent of floral arrangements that were starting to wilt under the tension. Ryan adjusted the microphone, and the resulting screech through the speakers felt like a warning aimed directly at my heart. He adjusted his tailored suit, a garment that screamed success in a language I couldn't speak, despite being the one who provided the dictionary. 80 guests, 80 witnesses to a lie that was about to become my son's new truth. I could feel the weight of the gold pen set in my breast pocket, a heavy anchor pulling at my dignity. The room was expectant, the kind of silence you find in a court right before the verdict is read. Ryan cleared his throat, the sound amplified and godlike. He began by thanking the Beaumont family for their unwavering belief in him, his voice smooth and practiced. I waited for my name. I felt my heart hammer striking against my ribs, a primitive drumbeat of desperate hope. I thought that maybe after 4 years of being treated like a ghost, he would acknowledge the 40 years of grease and sweat that put that expensive silk on his back. How do you breathe when you're watching your own history being rewritten by the person who owes you the most? Ryan smiled, but it was a cold, professional expression I didn't recognize. He leaned into the mic and said he wanted to start the night by talking about the man who made all of this possible, a man who showed him what it truly means to be a leader. For a split second, I actually started to lean forward, my hand instinctively reaching for the lapel of my suit. Then Ryan turned his head. He made direct, warm eye contact with Charles Beaumont, his gaze lingering on the older man with a devotion he had never shown me. When he said the word father, he didn't look toward table 18. He looked at the man who had bought his loyalty with a corner office and a dowried daughter. Ryan leaned into the mic, a smile spreading across his face that I didn't recognize, and said, "Charles, tonight isn't just about my promotion. It's about the father you've been to me when I had no one else." I watched my son's mouth move, but the voice coming through the speakers didn't belong to the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball. It belonged to a stranger who had decided I was a mistake in his biography. The soft gasp from the audience after his last comment about Charles Beaumont being his true father felt like a collective intake of breath, a signal that everyone in the room knew they were witnessing an execution. Ryan didn't stop there. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes shining with a feverish corporate zeal. He began to pivot the speech toward his childhood, but he didn't speak of the Sunday mornings we spent fishing, or the way I used to carry him on my shoulders. Instead, he framed my 35 years as a factory foreman as a tragic lack of ambition. He mocked the union mentality that he claimed had stifled the air in our home, describing a narrow vision of a man who only cared about the next paycheck and a steady supply of widgets. I felt the eyes of the junior associates at table 18, darting toward me, their initial curiosity curdling into a sticky, suffocating pity. Ryan's voice boomed through the ballroom, claiming he grew up in a house where success was measured by how little grease was under your fingernails at dinner. He laughed, and the room followed suit, a polite ripple of amusement that felt like salt in an open wound. Widgets. He called 35 years of my life widgets. It was as if the blood, sweat, and the literal bone I'd left on that factory floor were nothing more than a punchline for a room full of people who had never known the weight of a wrench. From my shadowed corner, I noticed a pale blue glow reflecting off the podium's glass. My eyes sharpened, focusing on the rhythmic scrolling of text. He wasn't speaking from the heart. He was reading from a teleprompter. This entire character assassination had been scripted, edited, and rehearsed weeks in advance. It wasn't a moment of spontaneous passion. It was a calculated liquidation of my existence. Then came the final crushing lie. Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a theatrical, reverent tone as he spoke about his MBA. He told the crowd that Charles Beaumont was the one who saw potential in him and funded his education when others doubted his path. I clutched my water glass, my knuckles white and straining against the cold surface. I remembered the night I sat at the kitchen table, signing over $45,000, the entirety of my wife Mary's life insurance, and every cent of my 401k just to ensure he didn't graduate with a mountain of debt. Ryan called Charles Dad, while gesturing for the older man to stand, and the metallic tang of adrenaline and bile rose in the back of my throat. Have you ever heard your own bloodline disowned in a room full of strangers? It sounds like glass shattering in a vacuum. As the room erupted in thunderous applause, and Charles Beaumont stood to embrace the man I had raised, I felt a sudden, terrifying drop in my blood pressure. It wasn't a heart attack. It was something far more permanent. It was the total, icy death of my paternal love. The water glass in my hand began to tremble, the surface of the liquid vibrating with the force of a heart that was finally mercifully turning into a stone. I didn't wait for the dessert or the forced handshakes. I stood up while the room was still erupting for the man who had just stolen my life story. The standing ovation was a wall of noise, 80 people celebrating a fiction that had meticulously erased 40 years of my sweat. I slipped past the floral arrangements and the service doors, my movement unhurried and invisible. On a waiter's abandoned tray near the exit, I placed the gold-embossed pen set. A gold nib can't fix a soul that's been traded for a corporate title, and I no longer wanted that dead weight in my pocket. As I moved through the lobby, the air felt thinner and more honest than the manufactured atmosphere of the ballroom. I walked toward the valet stand, feeling the stiff wool of my new suit move against my skin like a shroud I was ready to shed. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and realized I wasn't just leaving a party. I was leaving behind the version of myself that would have ever forgiven them. That man died tonight drowned in the applause for a stranger who used to be my son. I pushed through the glass doors, the mountain air hitting my lungs like a bucket of cold water. It was sharp and clean, cutting through the scent of expensive floor wax. I reached the valet line just as a couple of stragglers were leaning against a pillar laughing. They didn't see me, or if they did, I was just a ghost in an off-the-rack suit. One of them mocked the old guy in the back, repeating Ryan's lines about the factory mentality, with a cruel, drunken relish. The Ford engine roared. It was a beautiful, honest sound. Metal hitting metal, no lies, no teleprompters. I handed the last $5 bill in my pocket to the valet and told him to keep the change. He didn't thank me, but the engine didn't care. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, the dashboard glow reflecting in my eyes. The words of those strangers didn't hurt me. Instead, they acted like a chemical catalyst, solidifying my decision to burn every bridge I ever built for those ungrateful children. The hotel was a sinking ship, and I was the only one who realized the lifeboats were already gone. I drove through the winding Asheville streets, the city lights blurring into long streaks of cold white and red. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a consequence. Every double shift, every sacrificed vacation, every cent of Mary's life insurance, it was all a debt that was now being called in. The mountain air rushed through the cracked window, smelling of pine and exhaust fumes. I was done with the pretense. I was done with the hope. By the time I turned onto my gravel driveway, the adrenaline had settled into a strategic coldness. I pulled the truck to a stop, but I didn't turn off the lights immediately. I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, and then I saw it. A light was on in my kitchen. I hadn't left it on. As my eyes adjusted to the shadows, I realized I'd been being watched long before this night even began. I sat in the dark of my truck, watching the shadow of a man I didn't recognize, standing in my kitchen window. And I knew the war hadn't just started. It had come to my front door. The iron wrench felt heavy and honest in my palm, a stark contrast to the silver-tongued lies still echoing in my ears from the grand bohemian. I didn't reach for my house keys as I stepped out of the truck. I kept my fingers wrapped around that cold length of steel. I had seen the shadow in the window, and after the public execution of my dignity at the hands of my own son, I was in no mood for more surprises. I moved through the side door with the silence of a man who knew every creak in the floorboards. I rounded the corner into the kitchen, the wrench raised, ready to find whatever scavenger had come to pick at the remains of my life. "Put the wrench down, Frank. It's just me." Earl Thorne, a 69-year-old retired detective who still smelled of stale coffee and old union meetings, sat at my kitchen table with a grim set to his jaw. I lowered the tool, but the adrenaline didn't leave my system. It just turned into a cold, focused energy. Earl explained he'd let himself in after seeing me pull away from that fancy hotel so early. He'd watched the live-streamed speech on his tablet, and he knew I'd be returning home in a dangerous state of mind. But Earl hadn't just come to check on my health. He leaned forward, his voice low, and told me that while I was being shamed in silk, Ryan had been busy. He'd found evidence that my son was already trying to poke around in my medical records, looking for a way to prove I wasn't fit to handle my own affairs. I sat down opposite him, the weight of the betrayal making the wooden chair feel like stone. "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked him. Earl nodded once. "I saw enough to know you need a lawyer and a locksmith in that order," he said. 35 years of foreman wages. Every cent I saved for them was a brick in the wall they just used to crush me. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with ungrateful children. I was dealing with predators who were already measuring the depth of my grave. After Earl left with a promise to start digging into Ryan's recent activities, the house fell into a silence so thick it was hard to breathe. I moved through the rooms like a surgeon, my emotions cauterized by a new clinical purpose. I took down every framed photo of Ryan and Sarah. I didn't linger on their faces or remember the days the pictures were taken. I simply removed them, leaving behind nothing but empty pale hooks on the walls. The house felt lighter with their faces off the walls, as if I were finally purging a fever that had lasted 4 decades. I pulled cardboard boxes from the attic, the edges sharp and dry against my skin. I began to pack the trophies, the high school diplomas I'd paid a fortune to frame, and the art projects I'd cherished like holy relics. I worked until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the blinds, labeling each box with a precise, blocky script. My phone lit up on the counter, the vibration a persistent hum against the laminate. A text from Ryan. "Where did you go?" Charles was offended. I didn't reply. I realized he didn't care if I'd made it home or if my heart was still beating. He only cared about the optics of the head table. The phone buzzed again. Ryan calling this time, but I didn't look at the screen as I taped the first box shut with a sound like a gunshot in the morning quiet. I didn't bother with a greeting when I sat across from the man who had handled my wife's estate. I just laid my 1995 will on the mahogany desk and told him to find a way to burn it legally. The morning had been a blur of packing tape and hollow rooms, and by the time I reached downtown Asheville, the surgical detachment I'd felt at dawn had hardened into something permanent. Merritt Prescott, a man in his late 60s who had spent 4 decades smoothing over the legal messes of Asheville's middle class, looked at me over his gold-rimmed spectacles with a mixture of pity and professional caution. He reached for the document, but I kept my hand on it for a second longer than necessary. I told him about the Grand Bohemian, about the teleprompter lies, and the way Ryan had credited a stranger for the education I'd bled to fund. Merritt sighed, the scent of his wintergreen mints drifting across the desk. He didn't seem surprised, which was the first sting of the hour. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me that Ryan had actually called the office 2 months ago. My son had been pretending to check in on the status of the will, asking subtle questions about whether the assets were protected from outside interference. It was a cold realization. The betrayal at the gala wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment, but the final act of a long-planned siege. Merritt asked me if I was sure, reminding me that cutting off my own blood was a permanent move. I told him my blood had already disowned me in front of 80 people last night, and I was just making the paperwork match the reality. Is it still an inheritance if you've already paid for it with your soul? I didn't think so. I instructed him to remove Ryan and Sarah from everything: the house, the life insurance, the small savings I had left. In their place, I named a local animal shelter and a trade scholarship fund for young men who actually wanted to work with their hands. Merritt explained the concept of an irrevocable trust. He told me that once these papers were filed and the assets moved, even a judge would have a hard time breaking the barrier. I watched the scratching of his fountain pen across the thick legal bond paper, a sound that was far more satisfying than the string quartet I'd heard the night before. I realized that by signing these pages, I was removing the only reason my children ever bothered to check on me. I was becoming financially invisible to them, and the thought gave me a grim sense of peace. Signature after signature, each one a nail in the coffin of my servitude. I wanted the legal walls as solid as the foundation of the mill I worked in for 30 years. As we reached the final page, I had him add one last clause, a poison pill. If the children ever attempted to sue the estate or contest the trust, their own children's trusts would be immediately forfeited and donated to the same charities. I was protecting the next generation from the rot of the current one. I stood up the cold brass handle of the office door, feeling solid in my grip. I left Merritt's office with a lighter pocket and a heavier secret, knowing that the next time Ryan looked at my house, he wouldn't be looking at an inheritance. He'd be looking at a fortress he could never enter. The diner on Patton Avenue was the kind of place where men like me went to disappear into a cup of black coffee and the hard truths of the past. The smell of burnt coffee and cheap vinyl always helped me think, but the look on Earl Thorne's face told me I wasn't going to like the thoughts coming my way. I slid into the booth across from him, the cold sweat on my neck reacting to the blast of the diner's air conditioner. Earl didn't offer a pleasantry. He just tapped a thin, weathered folder lying open on the laminate table right next to a menu stained with old grease. He had been digging into my banking records from nearly a decade ago, looking for the cracks in the foundation I'd missed while I was busy working. He asked if I'd ever given Ryan my power of attorney back in the day. I told him I had, but only for medical emergencies when Mary was at her worst. Earl's gravelly voice dropped as he pointed to a specific withdrawal from June 2016. $35,000. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. That money wasn't just a number in a ledger. It was the specialized fund I had set aside for Mary's final cancer treatments. I had spent years believing we'd simply run out of money because the cost of her comfort was so high. I had lived with the guilt of not being able to provide more, never realizing the well hadn't run dry, it had been siphoned. 35,000. In 2016, that was my house, my pride, and my wife's comfort, gone in a single forged stroke. I stared at the photocopied signature card Earl pulled from the vault of the folder. It was my name, written in a hand that mimicked my own with terrifying precision, but it lacked the slight tremor I'd developed after 30 years on the assembly line. I pointed to the letter S, noting how the bottom loop was tight and clipped, not the long, lazy curve I'd practiced since grade school. Earl leaned back, the sizzle of the griddle behind us sounding like static in my brain. He told me it was Ryan's hand, and that my son hadn't even tried that hard to hide it, because he knew I'd never check an old ledger while I was grieving. How do you look at a man who grew up in your house and see a thief who started robbing you before his own beard was fully grown? The metallic tang of rage filled my mouth, more bitter than the black coffee I'd been nursing. I felt the rough grain of the diner table under my palms, the same hands that had worked double shifts to cover the interest on Ryan's MBA, while he was systematically draining my wife's peace of mind. But Earl wasn't finished. He dropped a final bombshell that made the air in the diner feel like it was disappearing. Ryan didn't just steal the cash. He had listed the reason for the withdrawal on the internal bank memo as incompetent parent, long-term care deposit. He had started the paper trail for my senility 9 years ago, weaving a web of lies to catch me before I even knew I was being hunted. I looked at the forged signature one last time, my eyes stinging not with tears, but with the realization that my son hadn't just stolen my money. He'd been planning my disappearance for 9 years. Earl didn't close the folder. He just turned the page to a list of debts that made 35 grand look like pocket change. I stared at the forged signature one last time, my eyes stinging not with tears, but with the realization that my son hadn't just stolen my money. He'd been planning my disappearance for 9 years. Now, the secondary folder Earl pulled from his satchel was twice as thick, stuffed with the kind of financial rot that usually stays buried until the bank comes for the keys. I watched his steady hands smooth out a spreadsheet. The mountain of high-interest consumer debt was breathtaking, but it was the 2 secret second mortgages on Ryan's luxury home that made me lean back against the greasy laminate of the booth. Every expensive suit he'd worn to that gala, the Mercedes he drove with such arrogance, it was all built on a trapdoor. Earl pointed to a recent salary increase from the senior director promotion. It looked like a victory on paper, but a series of red ink annotations showed that every penny was already being garnished by a private lender that Charles Beaumont certainly didn't know about. He's leveraged to his eyeballs, Frank Earl said, his gravelly voice competing with the distant hum of a jukebox playing some forgotten country song. The house, the cars, the jewelry, it's all owned by the banks. He wasn't waiting for my love. He was waiting for my equity. My son was a polished mahogany door with termites eating the frame from the inside out. He wasn't climbing a corporate ladder. He was running on a treadmill over a pit. And he was looking at my house as the only thing that could stop his fall. The heat from my coffee cup seeped into my palm, but I felt stone cold. Then Earl slid a printout of Sarah's business accounts across the table. I saw her name and felt a fresh, primal betrayal. My daughter, the interior designer who always prided herself on her perfect taste, had been siphoning money from her firm to cover Ryan's interest payments. Sarah wasn't just his sister. She was his bookkeeper in a family-wide scheme of survival. She was keeping the lights on in his life, only because her own inheritance was tied to the same equity he was trying to liquidate. They weren't siblings anymore. They were business partners in a plan to harvest me like an old crop. How many times did I skip dinner to make sure they had a full plate only for them to treat me like the last item on a liquidation menu? I closed my eyes for a second. The smell of bacon grease and old newsprint suddenly nauseating. I realized then that my children didn't see a father when they looked at me. They saw a title deed and a life insurance policy that was taking too long to pay out. Earl tapped a specific line on the bottom of the page, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. He told me that Ryan had already listed my house on a shadow market for private sales, essentially putting a price tag on my roof while I was still sleeping under it. Then he whispered the worst of it. He pointed to a recent payment to an elder law specialist. "They aren't waiting for you to die, Frank," he said. "They're making a move to take control while you're still breathing." Earl didn't need to explain the term incompetency to me. I'd seen enough men at the mill broken by age to know it was a death sentence for a man's soul, but seeing it written in my son's digital hand was a different kind of murder. I sat in that diner booth, the air smelling of ink and ozone, as Earl slid a folder of pixelated printouts across the greasy laminate. He had been digging through the digital shadows, and what he found made the $35,000 theft look like a mere prelude. I looked at a series of hacked emails between Ryan and Charles Beaumont dating back 3 years. In them, Ryan painted a picture of himself as a lone wolf, telling Charles he had paid for his own MBA through sheer grit and 3 side jobs. There was no mention of the $45,000 I'd handed him from Mary's life insurance, or the fact that I was still making the monthly payments on the loan I'd co-signed. I discovered that Ryan was even charging his own children's private school tuition to a credit card he had secretly opened in my name, using the very paper trail of my alleged senility to hide his tracks from fraud detection. Grit. He called my blood money grit. In the mill, grit was what blinded you. In his world, it was what he used to blind his father-in-law. I watched Earl's nicotine-stained fingers tap a page where Charles Beaumont praised Ryan's self-made spirit, at the same time mocking the handout culture of the working class. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing I was the one keeping the roof over their heads, while they sat in ivory towers laughing at men like me. The rhythmic thumping of the diner's ceiling fan sounded like a countdown. My expensive habits, I read aloud, my voice sounding like gravel. Earl, he told Charles he was relieved Mary was gone, so he wouldn't have to keep supporting my expensive habits. I felt a cold sweat on the small of my back as I realized Ryan was talking about my wife's hospice care. He'd twisted the most painful months of my life into a financial burden I had supposedly placed on him. It was a lie designed to justify his eventually seizing my home to Charles. Reading these emails was like watching someone dismantle my house brick by brick, then tell the neighbors they'd built the whole thing with their bare hands. Every word Ryan wrote was a nail in the coffin of the man I thought I raised. The emails revealed that his senior director promotion was actually conditional on him cleaning up his family baggage. In his world, baggage was just a polite word for an aging father who knew too much. The promotion required me to be institutionalized a tidy way to remove the evidence of his true origins before he took his next big paycheck. I looked at the last page, a draft never sent, addressed to the elder law attorney Sarah had contacted. It contained a date for my wellness check, and as I read the numbers, the cold iron in my blood finally solidified. It was only 6 days away. I didn't blink as I looked at that date. 6 days was a lifetime for a man who knew how to operate heavy machinery. I didn't blink as I looked at that date. 6 days was a lifetime for a man who knew how to operate heavy machinery, but it was just long enough for my daughter to polish the bars of my cage. My thumb traced the edge of the paper, the fiber rough against my skin. The fear I should have felt was gone, replaced by the cold, rhythmic precision of a foreman assessing a structural failure. I turned the page to find a printed email from a nursing home brokerage addressed to Sarah. It wasn't just a suggestion for a facility. It was a confirmation of a $3,000 consultation fee paid directly to her for the successful referral of a new resident. My own daughter had put a finder's fee on my head before I was even through the door. Earl shifted in the vinyl booth, the screech of the metal legs against the tile sounding like a dying animal. He slid a second stack of papers toward me, these ones covered in Sarah's distinctive loopy handwriting and screenshots of her text messages. I watched as she described my deteriorating memory to Ryan, detailing how I had forgotten where I put my keys or how I had stared blankly at the television. It was a lie. I hadn't forgotten the keys. She had moved them to the top of the refrigerator where she knew I wouldn't look. She was building a case brick by brick, using her skills as an interior designer to draft a blueprint for my demise. She suggested installing high-contrast handrails and floor sensors in the hallway. I told Earl I still bench pressed 60 pounds at the YMCA, and his face stayed grim. He leaned over the table, the scent of his industrial soap mixing with the smell of burnt toast from the kitchen. "It's not for your safety, Frank," he whispered. "It's for the inspector's report. It screams frail. Scrap." That was the word I kept hearing in my head. I was a liability to be liquidated. I looked at the next sheet where the math became even more clinical. Ryan and Sarah had calculated the equity in my Asheville home down to the cent. $700,000. They had it all mapped out, a 50-50 split, after a 6-month buffer of private care to make it look like they tried. But the real rot was in the secondary plan. Once the cash was burned to pay off Ryan's failing business debts, they intended to move me to a state-funded warehouse. Ryan's text to Sarah was plain as day on the pixelated screen. He's lived on nothing his whole life. He'll be fine in the state ward. That was my son. He was talking about me like I was a piece of scrap metal to be sold for parts a machine that had outlived its utility and was now just taking up space on the factory floor. The distant rattle of a freight train hummed through the floorboards of the diner, a steady vibration that matched the pulse in my temple. How do you tell your children that the man they're trying to bury is the only one who ever truly dug them out of the mud? Earl turned the very last page. It was a message from Ryan to his wife, Jen. "Once the house is sold," he wrote, "we will finally be free of the Sullivan stench." It wasn't just about the money. They wanted me erased. I looked up from the texts, my hands steady as I pushed the folder back to Earl, the cold fury finally hardening into a weapon. No more digging, Earl. It's time to start the deliveries. Earl looked at me for a long time, the kind of look one soldier gives another when they both know there's no coming back from the next order. I could see the concern in the weathered lines of his face, but he didn't try to talk me out of it. He knew the weight of a heavy heart better than most, and he knew that once a man like me decides on a course of action, the time for sentiment has passed. I reached into my coat and pulled out my wallet, counting out the crisp $100 bills for his invoice. It was a business transaction now as clean and sterile as a factory equipment repair order. I wasn't paying him for the destruction of my family. I was paying him for the blueprints of the truth. I felt a strange, cold cauterization inside. The lingering traces of parental sorrow, the memories of little hands and school recitals were being burned away by the hard data in that folder. I told Earl that it was funny in a dark sort of way. I had been planning to sell the big house myself next month. I was going to move into a little bungalow out in Weaverville and surprise Ryan and Sarah with $100,000 each to help them settle their debts. I officially liquidated that plan in my mind right then. That money would be put to much better use now. Earl leaned forward, noticing I hadn't moved my mug. "You okay, Frank? You haven't touched your coffee." I looked at the dark, still liquid. "The coffee's cold, Earl, just like everything else in that folder. I'm not sad anymore. I'm just busy. Grief is a heavy fog, but anger is a high-intensity laser. It cuts right through the sentiment and shows you exactly where to aim." I was no longer a father being discarded. I was a foreman dealing with a structural failure. I needed to perform corrective maintenance on a broken system. I outlined the specs for Earl with the same precision I used to order steel for a job site. I want 4 copies of every text, every email, and every bank statement, I said, my voice as steady as an anvil. Put them in chronological order. Tabbed, indexed, professional. Earl took a slow sip of his own coffee, watching me over the rim. What are you going to do with them, Frank? I looked him dead in the eye. I'm going to give them a family legacy they can actually use. They wanted a warehouse for me, so I'll give them an audit they'll never forget. I didn't need a hug. I needed a high-speed printer and 4 liters of industrial-strength ink. I stood up the chair, screeching against the diner floor like a warning. As we walked out into the rain-slicked parking lot, the smell of exhaust fumes and wet asphalt filled my lungs, grounding me in the physical world. I told Earl to find me a professional printer in town, someone who could handle high-volume, sensitive corporate documents without asking why a retired foreman wanted 4 identical, leather-bound audits of a betrayal. I wanted these binders to look official, corporate, irrefutable. I climbed into my truck and turned the key, the low hum of the heater fighting the bite of the February air. I pulled into the parking lot of the office supply store, the fluorescent lights reflecting off my hood, like the first sparks of a fire I was about to set. The automatic doors of the Staples hissed open, inviting me into a world of white paper and black ink, where I would finally rewrite the ending of my life. The air inside was cool and sterile, smelling of fresh toner and plastic packaging. I walked past the colorful displays of school supplies and headed straight for the back, where they kept the heavy-duty equipment. I wasn't here for flimsy folders or cheap spirals. I needed something that felt like a sentence being handed down from a high bench. I meticulously selected 4 professional leather-bound binders. I ran my hand over the grain, feeling the stiffness of the covers. I chose thick, reinforced dividers and a heavy-duty industrial stapler that looked like it could pierce bone. When I asked a clerk if the binders would hold 500 pages without the rings snapping, he gave me a curious look. "They are our executive line, sir," he said with a practiced nod. "They will hold everything." I bought the most expensive, high-capacity ink cartridges they had, treating the purchase with the same gravity I once gave to mill equipment requisitions. In my cart sat 4 silver thumb drives as well. I had already spent the afternoon editing a specific piece of footage from the promotion dinner. I wanted each binder to carry a digital copy of that night, specifically a high-resolution loop of the moment Ryan looked at me and effectively disowned me for his new social circle. Ink. It's funny how something so liquid can become so permanent once it hits the page, like a promise or a curse. By the time I got back to my dining room, the house was silent, except for the rhythmic whirring of my printer. I set up a one-man assembly line on the mahogany table. I printed the highlighted text exchanges Earl had found, the forged signatures on my bank authorizations, and the glossy brochures for the state-funded warehouse where my children intended to dump me. I organized the evidence into 4 distinct categories: the debt, the theft, the conspiracy, and the final will. As I snapped the heavy rings of the first binder shut, the sound echoed through the empty house like a judge's gavel. I slipped a thumb drive into the pocket of each cover, making sure the labels were clear. The dining table where we once ate Mary's pot roast and laughed about school plays had become a forensic lab where I was autopsying my own family. Each page I tucked away was a piece of the life I thought I had now revealed as a calculated fiction. I felt a methodical coldness settling into my marrow. I wasn't acting out of spite anymore. I was a foreman cleaning up a catastrophic job site. I reached for my tablet to check the morning's schedule, but a small, persistent red icon caught my eye. A location. Shared notification was glowing at the top of the screen. I tapped it, and my stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. It wasn't an accident. Ryan had been monitoring my phone's GPS for the last week. He had a record of every trip I made to the attorney's office and every hour I spent at Earl Thorne's place. I looked at the icon, and realized Ryan wasn't just waiting for me to lose my mind. He was watching me build the gallows, likely assuming I was just wandering around in a confused daze. He thought he was the predator, but he was just keeping a close eye on his own destruction. Monday morning arrived with a cold mountain rain, the kind that washes the slate clean, whether you're ready for it or not. I watched the FedEx clerk slide the 4 leather-bound gallows across the counter, the barcode scanner chirping like a funeral bell for my children's secrets. I didn't flinch when she asked if I wanted insurance. No, I said, because if they are lost, the truth will still find its way home. I had spent the last week playing a digital shell game with Ryan. I realized he was tracking my phone, so I used the old foreman's trick of predictable movement to feed him exactly what he wanted to see. I left my phone in a diner booth while I met Earl, and I spent hours parked near a high-end assisted living facility while I was actually at the private investigator's office. Ryan likely thought I was measuring my own cage. He didn't realize I was sharpening the axe. I paid for the priority overnight shipping signature required, ensuring they would hit their targets by mid-morning. Outside, the rain slicked the pavement of Patton Avenue, and the cold air bit at my neck. I climbed into my truck and left my phone on the dashboard, dark and silent. I refused to look at the screen until the kill time I had calculated. Signature required. I wanted them to have to look the delivery man in the eye before they looked at their own sins. I wanted their names signed on the line before the trap snapped shut. By 11:30, the first wave of gravity hit. In a high-rise office downtown, Ryan sat behind his mahogany desk, preparing for a board meeting that would cement his standing with Charles Beaumont. His assistant placed the heavy package on his desk, and he likely expected a set of title deeds to my home. Instead, he opened the leather cover to find the words, "Evidence of theft and elder abuse," staring back at him in high-definition color. Across town at her design studio, Sarah was deep in a client consultation, the scent of expensive lavender filling the room. Her intern brought in the special delivery, and Sarah, with a charming smile to her client, excused herself to open it. Her jewelry rattled as her hands began to shake. "What is this?" A joke, Ryan whispered to his empty office, his face turning the color of ash. Sarah simply stood frozen, her eyes darting across the printed screenshots of her own texts. The binders didn't just contain paper. They contained the sound of a father's heart, finally stopping its rhythm of forgiveness. It was a forensic autopsy of a relationship that had died long before the ink hit the page. Ryan flipped the pages, his breath coming in shallow hitches. He expected a list of what he had taken from me, but as he reached the section labeled Forensic Accounting, his knees hit the floor. I hadn't just listed his thefts. I had compiled a directory of every person he had ever lied to about his wealth, including a full contact list for the Beaumont estate. My son had spent years building a house of cards, and I had just handed him a match. Sarah's vision blurred as she realized the depth of the betrayal she had committed, her own handwriting, condemning her in every paragraph. Ryan's hand shook so hard, the binder rings rattled, but it was the yellow, sticky note on the final page that drained the remaining blood from his face. I'm not the only one who received a copy today. The first buzz of my phone sitting on the truck's dashboard felt like the first drop of rain before a hurricane, cold, rhythmic, and inevitable. I didn't reach for it. I simply watched the device dance against the plastic console as I pulled away from the FedEx office, the mountain air carrying the scent of coming rain. Ryan's name flashed across the screen in a bright, demanding glow. Before I reached the first stoplight, the notification shifted from a missed call to an automated reply. I had set a specific rule for their numbers earlier that morning. Every time they tried to reach me, my phone would fire back a single high-resolution image of the empty chair at the promotion dinner where I should have been sitting. It was a silent testament to the moment they chose to bury me while I was still breathing. I drove toward the Blue Ridge Parkway, the winding roads offering a quiet sanctuary from the digital storm. By the time I reached a scenic overlook, Sarah's name had begun to alternate with Ryan's in a desperate staccato rhythm. I pulled over and stepped out of the truck, feeling the rough wood of the porch-like railing beneath my palms. I watched the phone through the window. It buzzed and slid a trapped insect in a glass box. Have you ever noticed how the sound of a vibrating phone can mirror the rattling of a cage? For 42 years, I was the one inside. Today, the bars just moved. I was no longer the burden being managed. I was the architect of their sudden crashing reality. The mountain pines hissed in the wind, a soothing contrast to the frantic electronic chirps. I waited until the sun began its slow descent, painting the ridges in bruised purples and golds, before I finally drove back home. I sat on my porch as the dusk settled, the air turning sharp and cold. My phone was heavy in my pocket, bloated with the weight of 24 missed calls. I finally opened the first voicemail. Ryan's voice was a jagged mess, starting with corporate indignation, before spiraling into a high-pitched, childlike terror. "Dad, answer the goddamn phone. You can't do this. You're ruining everything, do you hear me?" I listened to the end, then tapped the screen. Message deleted. Sarah's messages were worse, a cacophony of sobbing and frantic excuses. She blamed Ryan for pushing the nursing home idea, claiming she was just trying to keep the peace. Then came the ultimate play, her voice cracking with a manufactured fragility. "Dad, I was pregnant. I'm still pregnant. Please, we need to talk." I didn't feel a flicker of the old guilt. I knew my daughter. I knew she would weaponize a heartbeat to save her own skin. Deleted. Every lie, every sob, every manipulation. Gone with a tap of my thumb. The mechanical voice on the system sounded like a prayer as it confirmed each erasure. As I went to delete the final message, a notification from my bank popped up. Ryan had just attempted to reverse the $35,000 withdrawal from 9 years ago, filing a fraudulent error claim to claw back the money before I could use it against him. Even while pleading for mercy, he was still reaching for my wallet. I sat in the gathering dusk, the silence of the mountains finally returning, and whispered to the empty porch. Tomorrow's package won't just tell them what I know, it'll show them what I'm going to do about it. Tuesday morning didn't just bring the sun. It brought the second FedEx truck, this one heading straight for the heart of Ryan's corporate kingdom, with a delivery that carried the weight of a prison sentence. I sat in my armchair, the house quiet save for the soft hum of the refrigerator, and checked the tracking on my tablet. The delivery was confirmed at 10:30 sharp. In my mind's eye, I saw the glass-walled office, the Italian leather chairs, and the chrome accents that my son called success. Ryan likely reached for the binder with a trembling hand, expecting more of the same, but I had raised the stakes. The second package was a targeted strike. I had included a full-page blow-up of the 2016 signature card, my name forged in his jagged, arrogant hand, highlighted in a red so bright it looked like a fresh wound. Next to it, I had printed the North Carolina legal statutes for felony embezzlement. I wasn't talking about family disappointments anymore. I was talking about the district attorney. The real blow, however, was the delivery route itself. Ryan soon discovered the package had been processed through the firm's general mailroom first. By the time it hit his desk, the seal had been broken by a compliance officer, and the cover page, "Evidence of Theft," had already been witnessed by the very people who held his professional life in their hands. "He's going to report me," Ryan must have whispered to his reflection in the glass. "The old man is actually going to send me to jail." The transition from corporate shark to cornered animal happened in less than 3 hours. 17 missed calls, 3 voicemails, one son who had finally realized that the old man knew how to fight back. I didn't answer. I just watched the front gate on my security feed. Around 2 o'clock, Ryan's silver sedan roared up the driveway, kicking up gravel like a spray of bullets. He didn't even turn off the engine before he was at my door, his face a mask of sweating, blotchy panic. He began to pound on the solid oak, the vibration rattling the family photos in the hallway. "Dad, open this door." "We can fix the money, I'll pay it back," he screamed, his voice cracked, losing that practiced baritone he used for board meetings. When I didn't respond, the begging turned into a snarl. "You're losing it, Dad. This is senior abuse. I'll have you committed by dinner." Ryan's fists against my front door sounded like the desperate drums of a retreating army that had finally run out of ground. I felt a strange clinical detachment, like a foreman watching a machine finally shake itself to pieces. I reached out and tapped the intercom button, the ozone scent of the electronics faint in the air. I didn't speak to him. Instead, I let the speaker chime to get his attention. "Ryan?" I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm not just recording you. This camera feed is a live stream. I've shared the link with Sarah and Charles Beaumont. They're watching you right now." He froze, his hand raised for another strike. His eyes found the lens, and for a second, he looked like a ghost. He realized the world he had spent a decade building was evaporating in real time. I watched the screen as Ryan's face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure, ugly hatred, just before he turned and sprinted back to his car, his tires screaming against the asphalt like a dying animal. The silence that followed Ryan's departure was thicker than the mountain fog, but it only lasted until the phone on my kitchen counter began to ring with a number I hadn't blocked yet. Jen's. I stood by the sink, watching the screen illuminate the granite surface before I finally picked up. Jen Sullivan, Ryan's wife, a woman who spent 40 years of her life cultivating a persona of high society grace while keeping a sharp eye on the family ledger, didn't lead with a scream. She led with a sigh that was meant to convey a weary, maternal patience. "Mr. Sullivan, we all want what's best for you." She began, her voice strained but controlled. "Ryan is just overwhelmed. He's had a lot of emotional stress with the promotion, and he's not himself." I leaned against the counter, the smell of freshly brewed coffee offering a grounded contrast to her airy manipulation. "Don't insult me with a lie, Jen," I said, my voice cutting through her social maneuvering like a cold wind. "I've read your emails to the consultant. You didn't want what's best for me. You wanted the deed to this land." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. In her haste to defend her husband, she let the mask slip. She inadvertently revealed that the fire I'd lit was already consuming their world. Mentioning that Charles Beaumont had already begun questioning Ryan about the Sullivan debt I had highlighted in the binder. The Beaumont household was apparently in the middle of a civil war, and Jen was trying to negotiate a ceasefire before the foundation collapsed entirely. I informed her that the time for intermediaries had passed and hung up before she could offer another excuse. Why do people like Jen think a soft voice can hide the sound of a knife being sharpened behind their back? I turned my attention to the task at hand. I knew Ryan's retreat wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal to gather reinforcements. I cleared the kitchen table, moving methodically, and laid out the 4 original binders like a forensic display. A text from Earl chirped on my phone, confirming that Sarah had fled her design studio in a state of sheer panic to meet Ryan at a nearby parking lot. They were circling the wagons. I felt a sense of foreboding, but it was anchored by a resolute calm. I was a man who had spent his life preparing for structural failures, and this was the ultimate collapse. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the warmth of the ceramic mug steadying my hands, and waited. The scent of rain on the wind drifted through the screen door as the mountain weather began to turn. 2 cars, 1 mission. They weren't coming for coffee. They were coming for my signature and my keys. I watched from the living room window as the silver Mercedes and a dark SUV pulled into the driveway simultaneously. They moved with a synchronized aggression, positioning themselves to block my truck entirely. It wasn't just my children this time. I realized from the way a third unfamiliar figure sat in the back of Ryan's car that they had brought a private health assessor with them to attempt an immediate on-site incompetency evaluation. They were moving for the killing blow. I stood by the window and watched Sarah step out of her SUV, her face blotchy from crying, while Ryan emerged from his Mercedes clutching a stack of legal forms that looked like a death warrant. I didn't wait for them to knock this time. I threw open the front door and stood there with the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains behind me, a wall they weren't prepared to scale. Ryan stood on the top step, his face a frantic, blotchy mess of sweat and desperation, clutching a stack of legal forms like a shield. Behind him, Sarah leaned against the porch railing, her hands pressing into her stomach as she wept with a theatrical intensity that no longer moved me. A third man, thin and clinical in a cheap suit, stood by the cars the health assessor they'd hired to catalog my decline. "Step back, Ryan," I said, my voice as heavy and unyielding as a mill press. "You aren't bringing a stranger into my house to tell me I'm old." Ryan's eyes darted past me, catching sight of the kitchen table where the 4 leather-bound binders were already laid out, like evidence in a capital case. "Dad, be reasonable," he blustered, his voice cracking. "Look at your hands. Look at the way you're acting. This is for your safety." I didn't move an inch. I forced them to stand there in the mountain air, feeling the weight of the silence I'd built. Finally, I stepped aside, but only for my blood. "The man in the suit stays outside, or I call the sheriff for trespassing right now." Ryan gritted his teeth and signaled for the man to wait. They stepped into the hallway, the air suddenly thick with the scent of Ryan's expensive cologne and Sarah's salt-heavy tears. I led them to the kitchen, where the overhead light caught the silver rings of the binders. I opened the first one, pointing directly at the forged signature on the loan documents. "You said it was what parents do, Ryan. Did Mary do this to her father? Did I do it to mine?" Ryan stared at the page, his mouth working but no sound coming out. Sarah sobbed harder, a sound that filled the room like a leaking pipe. 30 years of grease and steel. Ryan forgot that a man who builds machines knows exactly how to break them too. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything in this conversation, are you still with me? Comment A if you think Ryan is truly sorry, or B if he's just terrified of jail, and add one short reason why. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you can stop here. The kitchen table wasn't a place for dinner anymore. It was an operating table, and I was the one holding the scalpel. I reached for the third binder, the one containing the text exchanges Earl had intercepted. I looked Ryan in the eye and began to read aloud, my voice devoid of the warmth he'd spent 40 years taking for granted. "He'll be fine in the state ward. He's lived on nothing his whole life. Those are your words, son, not mine." Sarah collapsed into a chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor as she buried her face in her hands. Ryan's face turned a deep, humiliated purple, his pride finally rupturing under the weight of his own greed. Driven by a final desperate instinct, he lunged across the table to snatch the binder from my hands. I was faster. I caught his wrist mid-air with the iron grip strength of 3 decades in the mill. I tightened my grip on Ryan's wrist until he winced, and as I leaned in, I could smell the terror on his skin, the same scent I'd smelled on the factory floor, right before a machine finally snapped. Ryan didn't pull away. He lunged, his face twisting into the very thing he'd always claimed I was, a monster, but the scream that left his throat was born of pure, distilled shame. I maintained my grip on his wrist. The heavy breathing in the quiet room, the only sound besides the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling the ridge. My son finally lost his executive polish. The mask didn't just slip. It shattered, revealing a jagged ugliness underneath. "You were an embarrassment," he spat, the veins bulging in his neck like angry snakes. "Growing up with grease under your nails and those stupid union meetings. Do you know what it's like to have Charles Beaumont look at me and then look at you? I had to invent a version of you that people could actually respect." He mocked the mediocrity of our home, the years of my life spent on the factory floor, and the simple blue-collar values that had put the very clothes on his back. Every invitation to a holiday, every Sunday dinner, It was all a burden, a social stain on his professional upward mobility that he had to manage. Sarah tried to reach out a hand to settle him, but Ryan snapped his head toward her. "Don't act so holy, Sarah." We used to laugh about his simple intelligence for hours after Christmas. We called him the old, reliable machine, because we knew exactly how much we could squeeze out of him without him ever figuring it out. Sarah flinched, as if she'd been struck, her face paling, as their shared secrets were dragged into the light. I listened to it all without flinching. His words were like sparks from a grinding wheel, hot, bright, and ultimately hollow. They didn't burn me. They just showed me where the metal was weak. I looked at the grease-stained table where Mary and I had planned a future for these people, and I felt a dry, metallic taste of finality on my tongue. When Ryan finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure hatred, I let the silence hang in the room until it felt like a physical weight. "There it is," I said quietly. 42 years, and I finally hear the truth. I don't have to wonder anymore, Ryan. You've shown me exactly what my sacrifice was worth to you. 0. I saw the flash of realization in his eyes the moment he realized that his verbal assault hadn't broken me. It had freed me. Why do we spend our lives building foundations for people who only want to use the bricks to build a wall against us? I slowly released his wrist, the tension leaving my hand in a dull ache. I looked at my children, really looked at them, and saw 2 strangers who happened to share my last name. Ryan began to gather his papers, his hands shaking, but I stayed his arm one last time. "I didn't hire a health assessor, Ryan." I tapped the screen on my tablet, showing him the credentials of the man waiting in the driveway. "That's a private security officer. He's here to ensure that once you leave this house, you stay off the property. Permanent-like." I stood in the center of my kitchen, a man who had been declared a failure by his own blood, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a king standing in a fortress they would never be allowed to breach again. Sarah started to cry, but the sound didn't reach my heart anymore. It just sounded like a faulty faucet that needed to be turned off for good. I stood by the kitchen counter, my hands steady and resting on the cool, slick granite, watching her launch into a calculated performance. She moved toward me, her jewelry rattling with every tremors she mimicked, and tried to reach for my arm. "Dad, you know I'm not like him." She sobbed, her voice reaching that high-pitched frequency she used as a child to get out of trouble. "Ryan bullied me into the nursing home plan. He threatened to cut me off if I didn't help him with the paperwork." I looked past her, noticing the way she stole a quick glance at her reflection in the microwave door, adjusting her posture to look more fragile. It was a curated display of grief for an audience she had already lost. I let her continue for a moment, listening as she invoked the memory of my late wife. "Mom would be so heartbroken if she saw us like this." She whispered, her artificial floral perfume thick and cloying in the small space. "Please just forgive me." I didn't flinch. Instead, I thought about the files Earl had pulled from Ryan's cloud storage. "I know about the deleted texts, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through her theatrics. "The ones where you laughed about how easy I was to manipulate as long as you cried a little. I saw the ones where you joked that I was so desperate for affection I'd believe anything you said." Her tears were like the coolant leak on an old boiler, enough to look like a crisis, but not enough to stop the engine from burning itself out. The room fell silent, save for the low, indifferent hum of the refrigerator and the smell of ozone from the intercom system. Sarah's tears stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. Her face shifted from the grieving daughter to a trapped animal in a split second, her eyes narrowing as the mask fell completely away. I leaned forward, the distance between us feeling like an ocean. "Forgiveness without change is just permission, Sarah. You don't want my grace. You want my silence. You aren't sorry you hurt me. You're sorry you lost the deed to the house and the finder's fee from the facility. For weeks, I watched the 2 of you treat my life like a liquidation sale, and now that the hammer has fallen, you want me to tell you it's okay." Why do the people who break you always expect you to provide the glue to fix the mess they made? I've spent my life building a foundation for people who only wanted to use the bricks to build a wall against me. You didn't come here today to apologize. You came here because your safety net is gone, and you're terrified of the ground. Forgiveness requires restitution and a change of character, neither of which I see in this room. You aren't asking for my heart. You're asking for permission to keep treating me like a disposable asset. I'm done providing that. The cold air from the open front door drifted into the kitchen, a reminder that the world outside was moving on without them. Sarah stood, stunned, her mouth opening and closing, as she realized the old tools of manipulation were useless against the man I had become. She didn't know how to respond, because for the first time in 44 years, the man she thought was her doormat had just become her judge. Ryan didn't like being ignored. He saw the way I dismantled Sarah and realized his only weapon left was the one thing he thought I couldn't live without his son. He stepped forward, the heavy thud of legal papers hitting the kitchen table punctuating his desperation. "You're going to die alone, old man." He snarled, his face contorting into a mask of pure spite. "You'll never see your grandson's face again. I'm going to make sure he forgets your name before he hits kindergarten." I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the sting of his threats. I felt pity. "He doesn't know me now, Ryan," I said, my voice as calm as the mountain shadows stretching across the yard. "You made sure of that with your busy weekends and your curated excuses. But when he's a man, he'll know I was the only one who didn't lie to him." I reached for a document in the binder and slid it across the table. I informed him that I'd already established an irrevocable trust for the boy. It was funded by the very $35,000 Ryan had stolen nearly a decade ago. I'd used the legal freeze Merritt Prescott initiated to claw it back before Ryan even noticed the transaction was being audited. The parents were completely cut out of the equation. The boy would access the funds only when he turned 18. Ryan's jaw tightened as he realized the ransom he was trying to collect had already been spent on the hostage's future. Why do people think blood is an all-access pass to a man's dignity? My blood is in the steel of this city, the bridges I helped maintain, and the reputation I built with 40 years of honest sweat. Not just in the veins of children who view me as an ATM. I stood up, my posture straighter than it had been since the day Mary died. "I'm choosing peace over pain," I told them, the words feeling like a reclamation of my own soul. "You two are no longer a part of that peace. My role as your safety net, your bank, and your convenient scapegoat is over. I lived in a kind of servitude to your expectations for far too long, and today I'm taking my dignity back." I walked toward the hallway, the smooth brass of the front door handle cool against my palm. "Out. Both of you. Before the security I hired assists you to the curb." Sarah let out a strangled sob, the lingering scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the damp mountain air blowing in through the screen. Dignity. It's a heavy word when you've been carrying someone else's shame for 40 years. But as I stood my ground, it felt light as a feather. I opened the door wide, inviting the evening chill to sweep out the rot. As they moved past me, I handed Ryan one final crisp white envelope. It was a bill calculated down to the cent for 30 years of uncompensated storage for the childhood boxes and old furniture they'd left cluttering my attic while they built their new lives. It was the final financial sting, a symbolic end to the idea that I owed them anything more. Ryan took the envelope, his fingers trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go, but it was his final look back that told me I hadn't just won a fight, I'd ended a legacy. The walk from the kitchen to the porch felt like the longest 3 yards of my life. But with every step, the floorboards stopped groaning under the weight of people who didn't belong here. I stood as a silent sentinel on the weathered wood, watching Ryan and Sarah descend the steps for what I knew would be the last time. As those taillights disappeared into the deepening mountain shadows, I realized that I wasn't just watching them leave my property. I was watching the last bit of leverage they ever had over my heart evaporate into the crisp mountain air. Ryan's face was a twisted mask of impotent fury as he reached his Mercedes, while Sarah's performance had finally dissolved into a cold, hard silence that suited her far better than the fake tears. They climbed into their expensive car's vehicles, partially funded by the very man they had tried to erase, and the sound of their tires kicking up gravel was the most beautiful applause I had ever heard. I stayed there until the hum of their engines was swallowed by the whispering pines. The cool evening air brushed against my face, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth scrubbed clean of the cloying, artificial floral perfume Sarah always wore. I turned back toward the house and stepped inside, the click of the deadbolt echoing through the hallway, like a final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. For the first time in years, the air in the house felt light. Red taillights in the dusk look a lot like embers from a fire that has finally burned itself out. No more heat, no more smoke. Just ash. I walked slowly through the rooms, noticing the empty wall hooks and the faint outlines where photos of family vacations and forced smiles used to hang. I didn't feel the hollow ache I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if I had finally evicted the ghosts of my own expectations. I had spent 4 decades trying to build a legacy out of people who only wanted to tear the house down for the scrap metal. I made my way to the living room, where the dusk shadows were stretching long fingers across the floor. I sat down in my old armchair, the worn fabric familiar and supportive against my back. "It's finally quiet," I whispered to the empty room. 42 years. That's how long I carried them. I didn't realize how much my back ached until I put the burden down. The silence wasn't the lonely kind that had haunted me after Mary died. It was a peaceful, earned solitude. I reached into the drawer of the side table and felt around in the back until my fingers brushed against a small, yellowed scrap of paper. I pulled out the handwritten note from Mary that I had tucked away years ago, a private message she'd left in my toolbox before her final hospital stay. It simply said, "Live for yourself, Frank." I stared at her elegant looping script until the darkness made it impossible to see the ink. I finally understood that I hadn't just defended my home. I had fulfilled her last wish. I leaned my head back, listening to the profound silence of a house that was finally truly mine. I sat in the dark, the mountain night pressing against the windows, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring or a door to slam. I was just waiting for the morning. The sun didn't just rise the next morning. It broke over the ridge like it was seeing a new man, and for the first time in 40 years, the coffee in my hand didn't taste like an obligation. I stood on the porch, the steam from my mug rising into the crisp Appalachian air, listening to the birds returning to the ridge. Their songs were the only things breaking the quiet, and it was a sound I found I could finally live with. I spent the following weeks with my hands in the dirt, tending to the new green shoots in the vegetable garden Mary had once loved. The rough soil between my fingers felt grounding, a physical reminder that life could be cultivated rather than just managed. I ignored the few flying monkeys Ryan sent my way, distant cousins and old business associates who tried to weaponize guilt. My internal walls were now impenetrable to their calls. Even the mail brought a strange kind of peace. I received a final legal notice from Merritt Prescott detailing the fallout of my defensive measures. Ryan had attempted to contest the irrevocable trust I'd set up for my grandson, but he hadn't accounted for the poison pill clause I'd insisted upon. His legal maneuvering triggered a secondary freeze on Sarah's design studio assets, throwing them into a frantic mutual lawsuit. I watched my children turn on each other from a distance, feeling nothing but a mild clinical interest. Silence. It isn't the absence of noise, it's the absence of fear. I hadn't heard it in decades, but now it filled every room of my house like a warm light. By the time May rolled around, I felt a pull toward something beyond my own fence line. I drove into town to the Buncombe County Literacy Center, A small building that smelled of pine-scented cleaner and the comforting dust of old library books. I met the director, Elena Vance, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a binder full of local struggles. She looked at my rough, calloused hands and didn't see a foreman. She saw a teacher. I told her I used to teach men how to run 10-ton presses, and that I figured I could teach them how to navigate a paragraph. "We don't need foremen here, Mr. Sullivan," she said with a soft laugh. "We need patience." I looked at her and smiled, the weight of the last 40 years, finally feeling like an asset instead of a burden. "I've got plenty of that now," I replied. "I just spent 4 decades waiting for my life to start." Words are just another kind of tool. If you don't know how to use them, the world will always find a way to use you instead. I understood that better than anyone. As Elena led me toward a small classroom under the hum of fluorescent lights, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with my bloodline. It was a liberation I hadn't known was possible. I realized my first student was a young man who had been fired from Charles Beaumont's logistics firm for unreliability. Looking at his intake form, I saw the truth: he wasn't lazy. He was just illiterate, unable to read the very manifests that dictated his life. It was a Beaumont wrong I could finally help right. I opened the door to the small classroom and saw a name on the roster that made my heart stop. Not because it was a Sullivan, but because it was the first name of a future I was finally allowed to own. I pulled into my driveway with the smell of old library books still clinging to my sweater, only to find a piece of the past taped to my front door like a yellowing bandage. The session at the Literacy Center had been more than productive. I had looked at the roster earlier that morning and realized the young man sitting across from me was the son of a man I'd fired from the mill nearly 15 years ago for theft. It was a strange, quiet justice to be teaching the boy how to read the world that had broken his father, a full circle of repair that felt right in my calloused hands. I stepped onto the porch and peeled the handwritten letter from the wood. The yellowing tape left a sticky residue that I knew I'd have to scrub off later. I recognized the loopy script immediately. It was from Sarah. The paper still carried a faint, cloying scent of her expensive perfume, but the words inside lacked any real weight. She didn't offer a single word of apology for the attempted theft of my home or the referral fee she'd accepted to lock me away. Instead, she begged me to be the bigger person for the sake of the family image. She mentioned that Ryan's career was in a tailspin and that the social fallout was becoming unbearable. I read it with the same clinical detachment I'd use for a grocery store circular. She wasn't asking for my love. She was asking for a mask to hide behind. I folded the rough paper back into thirds and dropped it directly into the recycling bin by the door without a second thought. Family. It's a word people use when they want to rob you and still expect a thank you note. I didn't let it spoil my afternoon. Later that day, I found myself at the Ingles grocery store enjoying the simple rhythm of choosing my own path through the aisles. The fluorescent grocery lights were bright and indifferent, humming with a low energy that matched my own calm. I was rounding the corner of the dairy aisle, reaching for a carton of eggs when I came face to face with Jen Sullivan. She looked haggard, stripped of her usual high society polish. Her hair was haphazardly pinned, and I noticed her chipped manicure as she gripped the handle of her cart. She tried to corner me between the milk and the butter, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "You've ruined us, Frank," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what Charles Beaumont is doing to Ryan? He's officially cut him off, all because of your bitterness." I felt the cold carton of eggs in my hand, a solid and real thing, compared to the ghost of the woman standing before me. Looking at Jen was like looking at a luxury car, with a blown engine shiny on the outside, but completely stalled and going nowhere. She didn't know that Charles had already reached out to Merritt Prescott to request a full audit of the firm's Sullivan accounts. She only knew the comfort was gone. "Excuse me, Jen," I said, my voice as steady as a mountain ridge. "You're blocking the organic 3 dozen. I've got a baking class tonight and I'm running behind." She stared at me, her mouth hanging open. as if she couldn't believe I wasn't engaging with her chaos. I walked past her without looking back, the wheels of my cart squeaking a rhythmic goodbye to the life I no longer had to fund. The shadows of the Blue Ridge were lengthening across my lawn, when I saw them, two silhouettes sitting on my porch steps, like the ghosts of a childhood I no longer recognized. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and for a moment I simply sat in the cab of my truck. The purple dusk sky was bleeding into a deep indigo, and the crickets had begun their rhythmic evening chatter. I stepped out, feeling the grit on the porch steps through my soles as I approached. Ryan looked smaller than I remembered, his expensive suit wrinkled and hanging off his shoulders as if he'd aged a decade in a single month. Sarah was beside him, her head bowed. They didn't look like power players anymore. They looked like children waiting for a punishment they finally realized they couldn't bargain away. "Dad, we have nowhere else to go." Ryan began, his voice devoid of its usual corporate steel. "Charles used the evidence you provided to seize my personal accounts as restitution for Jen's dowry. He's forcing a divorce on Sarah and a forced resignation on me. We're truly penniless, Frank." Sarah looked up, then a forced sob catching in her throat as she reached out a hand toward me. "We're still your kids, Frank. Doesn't that mean anything? Can't you just tell the auditors it was a misunderstanding? Give us one last chance to save our names." I stood before them, my hand resting on the solid wood of the front door. The cool brass of the lock was a grounding sensation against my palm. Standing there was like looking at the blueprints of a house that never got built. All that potential wasted on a foundation of sand. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected, nor the crippling guilt they were fishing for. I felt a devastating, hollow honesty. "I miss people too," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying through the damp, pine-scented air. "But I don't miss the two adults standing on my porch. I miss the Ryan who used to help me in the garage, getting grease on his forehead and actually being proud of a day's work. I miss the Sarah who thought a dandelion was a treasure worth keeping. But those people are gone, and they didn't die of natural causes. You killed them the moment you started viewing your own father as an asset to be liquidated." I watched them flinch. Honesty is a sharp knife. It doesn't just kill the lie, it bleeds the liar dry. "I'm not holding a grudge," I continued. "I'm holding a boundary. There is a profound difference. My grief for you is already finished, because I realized I was mourning strangers. You aren't here because you love me. You're here because the world you built out of stolen bricks finally fell down on your heads." I turned to open the door, my resolve as unmovable as the mountains behind us. Sarah lunged forward, her voice rising into a shriek. "You can't do this. I'm pregnant, Dad. Do you really want to abandon your grandchild?" Ryan snapped his head toward her, his face twisting in a moment of genuine exhausted irritation. "Shut up, Sarah," he barked. "That lie won't work twice." I didn't even turn around. The confirmation of her previous fabrication was just a footnote on a story I had already closed. I stepped across the threshold into the house that finally felt like a home instead of a waiting room. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, the sound final and flat, leaving the two strangers I had raised to figure out who they were in the dark. I didn't wake up at 5 to the sound of an alarm. I woke up to the sound of a world that finally made sense, where the morning light through the pines didn't carry the weight of someone else's debt. The air in the bedroom was cool, scented with the faint sharpness of wood smoke from the fireplace downstairs and the deep, clean aroma of fresh coffee. I lay there for a moment, my fingers tracing the rough grain of the wooden headboard, feeling a serenity so profound it felt like a physical presence. It had been 6 months since I turned the deadbolt on the people who shared my blood, but not my soul. Since then, the anonymous donor who funded the new trust for my grandchildren had been the Literacy Center Scholarship Fund itself. Every hour I spent teaching men to read was an hour that built a future Sarah couldn't touch. It was a clean reversal of power. My daughter's daughter would be supported by the very work I did to replace the toxic legacy my children tried to build. My house was no longer a fortress under siege. It had become a workshop of creation. I spent my Saturdays reviewing progress reports from the Literacy Center. 3 of my students had secured full-time employment last month, navigating contracts they could finally understand. I stood in my kitchen, the silence a comforting blanket, rather than a hollow ache, and realized that my life had finally become my own. 6 months, 180 days of breathing without looking over my shoulder. It's a miracle I didn't choke on the fresh air. I walked out onto the porch, the wood cold beneath my feet, and a light dusting of frost clinging to the pines. The morning paper lay there, a damp, heavy reminder of the world beyond the ridge. I picked it up, newsprint ink smudging my fingers, and turned to the community section. There, in a small, grainy square, was a birth announcement, Sophie Marie Sullivan. I felt a heavy sigh escape my chest as I stared at the blurred photo of a child I had never held. Marie. You always did have a way with names, Sarah. It was a final, calculated reach across the divide, using my late wife's name to pull at a heartstring she had already cut. I looked at the little girl and felt a complex, distant peace. I loved the idea of her, but I no longer trusted the hands that held her. A name is just a label on a jar. It doesn't tell you if the contents have turned sour or if the fruit is still sweet. I knew that opening that door would only invite the rot back inside. I found a small baptism invitation tucked deep inside the folds of the paper. There was no return address, just a handwritten note on the back from Charles Beaumont. He wrote that she had her grandmother's eyes and that he was making sure she grew up knowing the man who had actually paid for her future. It was a strange alliance forged in the wreckage of our children's greed. The distant chime of church bells echoed through the valley, a sound of bittersweet finality. I set the paper down and looked out at the ridge, watching the sun burn the frost off the trees. I knew that while I would never be the man in their family photos again, I was the reason the new generation had a chance to start without the Sullivan stench. I was finally at rest, a foreman who had finished the hardest job of his life. The mountains don't care about wills or bank accounts. They only care about who has the strength to climb them. I sat at my desk in the soft amber glow of a January sunset, the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace mingling with the sharp, clean smell of fresh ink. I unscrewed the cap of the gold-nibbed pen I'd meant for Ryan and touched it to the blank page. A single drop of ink blooming like a dark secret I was finally ready to share with a girl who shared my wife's name. This pen was the only thing I kept from the night of the promotion dinner, a heavy, balanced instrument that I had reclaimed as a tool for truth rather than a gift for a liar. Dear Sophie, I began the scratching of the pen against the high-quality vellum, sounding like a steady heartbeat in the quiet room. By the time you read this, the world will have told you many things about where you came from. I wrote about the weight of a name and the danger of building a life on the shifting sands of other people's approval. I spoke to her about Mary, ensuring she would know the true strength of the woman she was named after. Bypassing the curated, hollow version of history Sarah would surely try to feed her. I wanted her to know that dignity isn't something you inherit. It is something you forge in the fire of your own choices. How many words does it take to explain a lifetime of silence to a child you've never held? I poured my years of industrial experience and hard-won wisdom into those paragraphs, treating each sentence with the same structural integrity I once gave to the mill's heavy presses. The light through the pines outside began to fade, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desk. I was just finishing the 3rd page when the clinical ring of my phone shattered the stillness. I checked the screen and saw the name of Merritt Prescott, my attorney. The cold glass of the phone felt jarring against my palm after the warmth of the gold pen. "Frank, it's Charles Merritt," said his voice, carrying a labored weight that immediately signaled a shift in the wind. "He went down this morning. A massive stroke in the middle of a board meeting. It doesn't look good." I leaned back in my chair, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin. The meeting Merritt continued was centered on Ryan's final embezzlements. The auditors had laid it all out. Is Ryan with him? I asked, my voice steady despite the shock. Merritt let out a heavy, cynical breath. Ryan is in the parking lot. Security won't even let him pass the lobby. The hospital staff has strict orders. The lobby. That's where Ryan was now. Tucked away in the background, just like he'd done to me. The irony was a bitter pill that left a metallic taste in my mouth. The titan of Asheville industry was falling, and the son he had chosen over his own blood was being treated like a common trespasser. Merritt cleared his throat, his voice dropping an octave as if he were sharing a final confession. Frank, there's one more thing. Before the stroke, Charles changed his power of attorney. He named me as his executor specifically to keep Ryan and Sarah from touching a single asset while he is incapacitated. He knew Frank. At the very end, he knew exactly what they were. Merritt paused, and I could hear his heavy breathing through the line. Frank, there's one more thing. Charles left a letter in his safe. It's addressed to you. The letter from Charles didn't smell like corporate stationery. It smelled like regret and expensive cigars. The final confession of a titan who realized too late that he had built his empire on the wrong kind of men. I sat in the quiet of Merritt Prescott's law office, the heavy paper of the letter feeling rough against my fingertips. Charles's handwriting was shaky, a stark contrast to the bold gold-leafed signatures I had seen on the news for decades. I have no intention of visiting him in the hospital. I believe this letter was his way of saying goodbye, a final attempt to square a ledger that had been out of balance for a long time, and I respect the silence of a man who finally told the truth. I read his words slowly, feeling a melancholy vindication settle in my chest. He admitted he had known about Ryan's lack of character for months, but was too proud to acknowledge his chosen protege was a hollow fraud. I thought I was buying a legacy, Frank, he wrote. I only bought a parasite. He confessed to envying the genuine connection I had to the work and to my family, even if that connection was now severed. The letter ended with a final request. He had set aside a small legacy fund for Sophie, my granddaughter, and he wanted me to oversee its distribution to ensure Ryan never touched a cent of it. Parasite. Charles used the word like a scalpel. It was the one thing we finally agreed on, a shared understanding of the rot we had both unintentionally cultivated. A few weeks later, I found myself walking through the Asheville Industrial Museum. The air inside was cool and smelled of floor wax and the faint, ghostly scent of machine oil. I had been invited to consult on a new exhibit about the mill where I had spent 35 years of my life. The curator walked beside me, his footsteps echoing in the hollow hall, but my eyes were locked on the old 10-ton press. It had been polished and placed under gold-leafed museum displays, a relic of a time when we built things with our hands. For the first time, I didn't feel like an embarrassing grease monkey or a footnote in someone else's success story. We want the labels to be accurate, Mr. Sullivan, the curator said. No one knows the rhythm of these machines better than you. I reached out and touched the cold steel of the press, my calloused hand finding the familiar grooves. It's not just a machine, I told him. It's the way we put bread on every table in this valley for 40 years. The mill was a monster that ate our youth, but standing here I realized it also forged the only parts of me that were still worth keeping. I felt a profound pride in the grease that had once lived under my nails. As I turned toward the glass doors to leave, I saw a familiar figure standing outside on the sidewalk. Ryan looked unkempt, his shirt wrinkled and his hair a mess. He was pacing, looking desperate, clearly trying to find me to beg for a temporary bridge loan now that Charles was incapacitated and his own accounts were frozen. I watched Ryan through the museum glass, a man who had disowned his father's grease, but was now begging for the coins it had earned. And I realized the machine of our family had finally ground to a total, irrevocable halt. I didn't open the door. I simply watched the city traffic move past him, a ghost in a suit that no longer fit. The mountains don't care about wills or bank accounts. They only care about who has the strength to climb them. And today, for the first time in years, my legs didn't feel heavy with the weight of someone else's life. I sat in the familiar vinyl booth of the Patton Avenue diner, the steam rising from my coffee in a lazy gray spiral. Across from me sat Linda, a woman in her late 60s with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes and a sharp mind for poetry, who leaned across the table and saw the man I was, not the bank I used to be. We had met through the literacy center, and our conversations had become the highlight of my week. We talked about the students I was tutoring and the garden I'd spent the spring restoring to its former glory. There was a warmth in our connection that had nothing to do with biological obligation or the expectation of a check. Linda leaned in, her eyes bright. "You've got a gift for making the complex sound simple, Frank," she said. "Those boys at the center really listen to you." I took a sip of the bittersweet black coffee, savoring the clean taste of mountain water. "It's just maintenance, Linda," I told her. "People are a lot like machines. If you ignore the friction for too long, they seize up. I'm just helping them clear the rust." As the afternoon sun poured through the windows, Linda revealed that she was the one who had anonymously nominated me for the Community Pillar Award. My own children had spent years treating me like a footnote or an embarrassing relic. But here was a neighbor who saw me as something more. A cup of coffee with a friend shouldn't feel like a victory, but after decades of drinking bile with my own blood, it tasted like the finest wine in the valley. I realized I had finally built a community that respected the man I had become. Later that evening, I returned to my kitchen, the house filled with a serene silence. I found a final desperate envelope in my mail. It was from Sarah, a grocery reimbursement check for $200 sent as a peace offering to prove she was doing better. I looked at her jagged signature and the meager amount, realizing it was just another hook intended to pull me back into the role of her emotional safety net. "Too little and years too late," I whispered to the empty room. I gripped the edges of the crisp paper. Ripping paper is a small sound, but in a quiet house it sounds a lot like freedom. I tore the check into 4 neat pieces, performing one last act of discipline to protect the boundary I had worked so hard to build. As the serrated edges gave way, I noticed another letter from the bank. It wasn't a bill or a notice of overdraft. It was a formal apology. They had finally cleared the $35,000 theft from my record, classifying it as a clerical error after the final audits from Merritt Prescott went through. The money I thought was gone forever, the money my son had tried to bury me with, was being returned in full. I let the pieces of Sarah's check fall into the bin and looked out the window at the deepening blue of the mountains. I had torn up a legacy of lies, but I had finally started writing a truth worth leaving behind. The last thing I did before I went to sleep was check the box for the scholarship winners. But the first thing I saw in the morning paper was the obituary of my son's reputation. I sat at the kitchen table, the newsprint crinkling under my calloused thumbs, reading the business column with the clinical eye of a foreman observing a long-predicted structural collapse. The headline spoke of a sudden resignation at Beaumont Logistics due to internal discrepancies. It was a polite way of saying the house of cards had finally folded. The article mentioned that an anonymous whistleblower had provided evidence so precise it suggested years of internal monitoring. I realized then that Earl's digging had hit a vein of pure rot. He hadn't just found Ryan's mistakes, he had uncovered Ryan's own automated logs of his thefts, a digital ledger of greed that my son had been too arrogant to delete. I felt no surge of joy as I read the hints of a widening criminal investigation. There was only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of knowing the truth was no longer my burden to carry. I had identified the failure, I had flagged the risk, and now the building was coming down on its own. Resignation. It's a polite word for a coward who got caught, but it meant the world I once inhabited was finally safe from the shadows I had raised. I spent the rest of the morning packing my old Ford truck. I moved methodically, placing my tools and a few framed photos of Mary into the cab. I took the house keys to Merritt Prescott, leaving him instructions to manage the property as a rental for the Literacy Center's staff. It was time for the house to be filled with people who valued the meaning of a word. I pulled out of the driveway, the rumble of the Ford engine, a steady companion as I left the Blue Ridge Mountains behind. I was heading toward the South Carolina coast, a trip Mary and I had planned a dozen times, but always deferred for the sake of the children's needs. The drive took hours, but for the first time in 68 years, the steering wheel felt light in my hands. As the elevation dropped and the air began to change, I rolled down the window. The smell of mountain pine was slowly replaced by something vast and wild, the scent of salt air and ocean brine. I reached the shore, just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. I stepped out onto the sand, the grains shifting beneath my feet, and walked toward the water. The ocean doesn't have a memory. It washes the shore clean every few seconds, and I finally understood why Mary loved it so much. I stood there, the salt spray cold on my face, and whispered into the wind, "I made it, Mary. We're here." Standing on that beach, I realized I wasn't the only one finding a new start. A few yards away on a wooden pier, a young man in his 20s was meticulously practicing a trade, working with a set of precision tools. He was wearing a white Sullivan Scholarship hat, the logo crisp against the blue horizon. The legacy was living, spreading out through the hands of strangers who actually respected the craft. I watched the tide pull the last of the Asheville dust from my boots, a man who had lost a family but found a soul. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to look back. When I look back at everything that happened, I realized this was never just about money or property. It was about dignity. My family story began with sacrifice, long shifts, and the belief that love meant giving everything to your children. But sometimes in a family story, giving without boundaries slowly teaches others that your life is something they can spend. That was my mistake. I believed silence was kindness and sacrifice was love. I was wrong. What people call dad revenge was never truly revenge to me. My dad revenge was simply the moment I stopped allowing betrayal to define my worth. It was the moment I chose truth over approval. And if my dad revenge taught me anything, it is this: justice without hatred is possible, but only when you finally learn to stand up for yourself. If you are listening to this family story, please learn from my failure before it becomes your pain. Love your family, but never erase yourself in the process. A family story should be built on respect, not entitlement. The day respect disappears, boundaries must begin. That is not cruelty, it is survival. I also believe that God sometimes allows storms in our lives not to destroy us, but to reveal what was already broken. Faith gave me the strength to stop begging for love and start living with dignity again. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Frank's situation, facing betrayal from your own children? I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories about resilience and difficult family choices. A quick note: while this narrative explores themes inspired by real family conflicts and social issues, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't what you're looking for today, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.